He wanted to retire. His team said no, and that single refusal is the reason the 2026 World Cup will not be remembered for who won it. A 40-year-old goalkeeper stood in front of a machine built to score, and when the final whistle ended it, he didn't celebrate. He cried. Within hours, 6 million strangers had subscribed to a man whose name, until that night, nobody outside his country could pronounce. This is not a story about football. It's a story about what happens when a man runs out of time and the moment doesn't care. You know this feeling, even if you've never touched a football in your life. The moment you decided you were done, you'd already said it out loud, maybe to your family, maybe just to yourself in the mirror. This is the last one, the last project, the last attempt, the last year you'd give it before walking away with whatever dignity was left. And then someone, a boss, a team, a circumstance, looked you in the eye and said, "Not yet." Not because they believed in your comfort, because they needed something from you that you'd already decided you didn't owe anyone anymore. That's where this goalkeeper was standing, body aching in ways 20-year-olds don't understand yet. Career already written, already filed, already grieved. He had made peace with the ending, and his team took that peace away from him and handed him a tournament against the best attacking machine on the planet instead. This isn't weakness. The fact that he almost said no, it's not some character flaw that he wanted out. The body keeps a ledger nobody else can read, and at 40, that ledger gets long. What's interesting isn't that he wanted to leave. What's interesting is what happens to a man who gets dragged back in against his will and finds waiting on the other side of that unwanted door the single best version of himself he has ever been. He's the mechanism, and it has a name. The Greeks split time into 2 words we don't have in English: Chronos, sequential time. The clock, the calendar, the countdown your body is running whether you check it or not. And Kairos, the other kind, the opportune moment, the crack in ordinary time where everything that matters happens at once, and it cannot be scheduled, postponed, or summoned by effort alone. His team was thinking in Chronos. 40 years old, statistically past prime, the actuarial tables of professional sports say his knees should be retired. His reflexes should be a half-second slower than they were 5 years ago, and a half-second is the entire distance between a save and a goal. But the night the ball started flying at him 10 times, from a team built specifically to make goalkeepers look small, something else was happening. Not Chronos, Kairos. The match wasn't measuring his decline. It was measuring whether a man could step out of linear time entirely and live for 90 minutes inside a single suspended moment where age, fatigue, and statistics stopped applying. This is the part nobody tells you about Kairos. It doesn't reward people who are ready. It rewards people who showed up anyway, dragged there by something outside their own willpower, and then refused to leave once the door opened. That sounds like an athlete having a good night. A statistical outlier, the kind sports commentators forget by the following season. But there's one thing we haven't named yet, and it's the same thing a man in Algeria figured out, decades before this goalkeeper was born, standing on a beach instead of a goal line, asking what a human being is supposed to do when the universe refuses to answer back. Albert Camus didn't arrive at his most famous idea in a library. He arrived at it during a war, in a country that wasn't fully his, writing for a resistance newspaper under a name that wasn't his own, watching people search for meaning in events that offered none. What he saw was this: the universe doesn't owe you coherence. It doesn't promise that effort will be rewarded, that fairness will prevail, that the story will resolve the way the story should. He called this the absurd. Not ridiculous, but the precise, permanent gap between what a person wants from existence and what existence is actually willing to give. Most people respond to the absurd in one of 2 ways. They either invent a comforting lie to paper over the gap, fate, destiny, a guaranteed ending, or they collapse into nihilism and stop trying altogether. Camus rejected both. His answer was the third path, and it's the hardest one. You keep playing anyway. Not because you'll win, not because the universe will notice, because the act of continuing, fully, without illusion, without guarantee, is the only form of dignity available to a creature that knows it's going to lose, eventually, no matter what it does. He wrote it most clearly through the myth of Sisyphus, the man condemned to push a boulder up a mountain forever, watching it roll back down every single time. Camus' conclusion wasn't tragic, it was almost violent in its optimism. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, because in the absence of any cosmic reward, the pushing itself, done with full awareness, full presence, becomes the entire meaning. There is no other meaning waiting behind it. This is the goalkeeper, not a man who believed his old tired body could outlast statistics, a man who understood, somewhere underneath the part of him that wanted to quit, that the boulder doesn't care if you're tired of pushing it. The tournament didn't owe him a storybook ending because he'd suffered enough to deserve one. The favorite team didn't owe him mercy because he was 40 and his joints ached on cold mornings. Nothing was owed. He had 10 shots fired at him by a machine that does not lose. And the absurd thing, the thing Camus would have recognized instantly, is that he kept meeting the ball anyway, save after save, with no promise that the 11th one wouldn't be the one that finally got through. The tears at the final whistle were not relief that the universe had finally been fair to him. They were the sound of a man who had just spent 90 minutes proving to no one but himself that meaning doesn't require a guaranteed outcome. It only requires full presence in the moment you're actually given. Even, especially, the moment you tried to refuse. Camus handed us a tool. Keep pushing the boulder, find the meaning in the act itself, refuse despair without inventing false comfort. But there's something he never warned us about. What happens the moment you look into that mirror and realize the boulder you've been pushing isn't the tournament, isn't the deadline, isn't the goal at all. It's something you built yourself a long time ago, and you've been calling it duty ever since. Here's the part that's harder to watch than the football. This man almost walked away on his own terms, and didn't because the people around him needed one more season out of his body. That's not a villain's story. Nobody forced him at gunpoint. What actually happened is quieter and more familiar. He held the lock on his own cage and called it loyalty. The illusion most people are chasing when they say yes to one more year, one more project, one more obligation they'd already decided to release, isn't really about the task itself. It's about what saying no would cost them. Being seen as the one who quit too early. Losing the identity that came from being needed, trading the discomfort of continuing for the much larger discomfort of being forgotten the moment you stop being useful. That's not weakness either. It's just what's actually happening underneath the noise of duty and commitment. A person protecting a version of themselves that only exists as long as someone else keeps asking them to show up. The goalkeeper got lucky, in a sense the philosophy doesn't usually allow for. His unwanted return produced the best performance of his life. 6 million strangers, a moment of mass recognition most people never get once. But that outcome wasn't guaranteed when he said yes. He didn't know it would end in tears of vindication instead of tears of exhaustion and regret. He said yes to the obligation before he knew which ending he'd get. Most people who hold their own cage door shut don't get the storybook version. They just stay. So here's the one tool worth taking from this. And it's not never give up. That's a slogan, not a method. It's older than that, and it comes from a different set of thinkers entirely. The Stoics. Their core operating principle was brutally simple. You don't control outcomes. You only ever control where your attention goes inside the present action. Not the score, not the opponent's 10 shots, not whether the crowd will love you or forget you by next season. Only the save in front of you, right now, the only piece of the universe actually inside your hands. This is the weapon before your next yes to an obligation you already privately decided to release. Ask one question instead of reaching for the usual justification. Not, do I have the energy for this? And not, will this make me look committed? Ask, if I can't control how this ends, is the act itself still worth doing for its own sake? If the answer is yes, even quietly, even uncertainly, that's not the cage talking, that's something real. If the answer is no, and the only thing left holding you there is the fear of how your absence will look, that's the lock you've been mistaking for loyalty. A goalkeeper couldn't control the outcome of that match. He controlled where his hands went, shot after shot, with no promise of what the 11th ball would do. That's the only part of the whole story that was ever his. Tell me about the boulder you're still pushing, not the task itself, but how long you've been calling it duty, instead of admitting its fear of being forgotten. You're not weak for almost walking away, and you're not weak for staying either. Both of those are just what happens when a person runs out of Chronos and prays for one moment of Kairos to make the math make sense again. He cried because for 90 minutes the universe asked nothing of him except presence. And for once that was enough. Somewhere, right now, someone else is being told not yet by a life that already promised them an ending. They don't know yet which kind of tears are waiting for them on the other side.